The British Commonwealth Forces Korea, or BCFK, was composed of Army, Navy, and Air Forces of the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and India during the Korean War. The BCFK was a rapid response force created in 1950 and would be active in the Korean Peninsula until 1956, 3 years after the war's end. Despite the fact that the BCFK was the official unit, some military forces from Commonwealth countries would serve in U.S. and UN formations that were not part of the BCFK. The BCFK was led by Lieutenant General Sir Horace Robertson, an Australian veteran of World War I and World War II. The unit was always to be led by an Australian general. Meanwhile, the operational level was commanded by British and Canadian officers. Lieutenant General William Bridgeford took over from Robertson in October of 1951, and he was later succeeded by Lieutenant General Henry Wells. After the war, Wells was succeeded by Lieutenant General Rudolph Beerwith in 1954, and the last CEO of the BCFK was Brigadier General Leonard Bruton in 1956. The BCFK was preceded by the British Commonwealth Occupation Forces, or BCOF, which, as the name suggests, was British and Commonwealth troops that were part of the Allied occupation of Japan after World War II. Australian units of the occupation forces were among some of the first UN troops that were sent to Korea in 1950. The BCOF then shifted its role to oversee the staging of the BCFK in Japan before sending them into Korea. The BCOF would continue this role until April of 1952. During the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter, the British Army, Australian Air Force, and the navies of Britain, Australia, and New Zealand supported the UN breakout of the perimeter. The British 27th Infantry Brigade was joined by the Australian 3rd Battalion in September, where they fought the Battle of Hill 282, where American planes mistook the British for North Koreans and accidentally killed 17 men and wounded 79 more in a friendly fire attack. However, the British were able to stop a North Korean attack, and Major Kenneth Moyer was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. The brigade would then be renamed the 27th Commonwealth Infantry after the addition of the 2nd Canadian Light Infantry Battalion in December of 1950. The BCFK was also present at the Incheon landings with British, Australian, New Zealander, and Canadian ships supporting the American Marines. During the Battle of Yongyu from October 21st to the 22nd of 1950, where the Australians distinguished themselves in their first major battle, where they relieved the American 187th Paratroopers in a link-up against North Korean forces. On the afternoon of the 25th of October, a platoon of Australians was fired on by 2 companies of North Koreans as they crossed the Taeyong River to conduct a reconnaissance of the western bank. Although the Australians would be forced to withdraw, they would take 10 prisoners with them. The North Koreans then conducted attacks with support from T-34s that cost them heavy casualties, while the Australians suffered considerably less than the North Koreans did. Further actions like this would continue as the Australians and British would make their way up the Korean Peninsula. However, after the retreat from the Yalu River, the Chinese winter offensive, which included the action in the Third Battle of Seoul in January of 1951, as well as the UN counteroffensive, the 27th Brigade was joined by the specially raised 16th Field Regiment of Royal New Zealand Artillery in January of 1951, and then by a Canadian Infantry Battalion in February. The brigade's final action was in the Battle of Kapyong in April of 1951, before being folded into the 28th Infantry. During this battle, one brigade of UN forces numbering 2,000 men successfully defeated 2 Chinese divisions of 20,000 men. The UN forces of primarily BCFK troops suffered 59 dead and at least 111 wounded, compared to 1 to 5,000 Chinese killed with many more Chinese wounded. On March 23, 1951, the United Nations launched Operation Tomahawk, which was the last airborne operation of the war conducted by the 187th U.S. Infantry. And the UN forces were supported by Filipino and Indian troops who were providing medical support in the operation, and the United Nations would be victorious against the Chinese and North Koreans. During the Battle of the Imjin River from April 22nd to the 25th, the British 29th Infantry fought with Belgian, Luxembourgish, Filipino, and South Korean forces against the entire 19th Chinese Army Group. The result of the battle prevented a Chinese breakthrough that would have encircled the South Korean 1st Division and U.S. 3rd Division and would have destabilized UN lines. The total UN casualties are unknown. However, the British lost 141 men killed and 1,169 men were wounded, missing, or captured. Meanwhile, the Chinese lost over 15,000 men. In July of 1951, the infantry brigades in the BCFK were combined to form the 1st Commonwealth Division as part of the U.S. 1st Corps. The Commonwealth units had previously been more independent of one another as part of the BCFK. The 1st Division consisted of 58% British forces, 22% Canadian forces, 14% Australians, 5% New Zealander forces, and 1% Indian troops. The infantry was primarily British, Canadian, and Australian, hence their higher percentages, while New Zealanders supplied artillery contingents and the Indians were medical. Of course, there were other units, but this was the case for the 1st Division. During Operation Minden in September of 1951, BCFK troops participated in a general UN advance along the Wyoming Line, which was the UN main line of resistance against the Chinese. The successful implementation of Operation Minden led to a large-scale Operation Commando, which involved substantial part of 1st Corps. Operation Commando was then launched in October of that year and resulted in the establishment of the Jamestown Line, where the BCFK headquarters would be established. During the First Battle of Mariang San in October, the Australians used tactics first developed against the Japanese in New Guinea during World War II, and gained the advantage of the high ground and assaulted the PVA positions from unexpected directions. They then repelled repeated PVA counterattacks aimed at recapturing Mariang San and Kowang San, with both sides suffering heavy casualties before the Australians were finally relieved by a British battalion. A month later, the PVA recaptured Mariang San during fierce fighting, and it was never regained again. This battle is widely regarded as one of the Australian Army's greatest achievements and accomplishments during the Korean War. There were additional battles which took place from 1952 to 1953, such as the Battle of Hill 355, where the Canadians occupied the hill against the Chinese. However, due to ongoing peace talks from the end of 1951 until 1953, the operations at Mariang San proved to be the last actions in the War of Maneuver, which had lasted for the previous 16 months. The Korean War then sunk into static warfare reminiscent of the Western Front of World War I for the last 2 years of the conflict. Royal Navy carriers provided the only British fighter planes that would take part in the war. On August 9, 1952, for example, a propeller-driven Sea Fury piloted by Lieutenant Peter Carmichael of the 802nd Squadron, based on HMS Ocean, shot down a MiG-15 jet fighter, becoming one of only a handful of pilots of propeller planes to have shot down a jet. Although some accounts suggest that a second MiG being shot down in the Korean War, Carmichael's kill is considered to be the only time that a British pilot in a British plane shot down a MiG, as at least 7 RAF pilots on exchange with USAF shot down MiGs. Did you know about the British Commonwealth Forces Korea before this video? Is there anything that I left out or should have talked more about? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.